Good evening. My name is Roxanne Chabot from RBC Consultants. Welcome to another International Dermatology Education Foundation educational series webinar. This evening, we're going to be discussing how to navigate the changing landscape of dermatology and industry relationships. As moderator, we have Dr. Leon Kircik. Dr. Kircik is president of the International Dermatology Education Foundation, clinical professor of dermatology at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York, Indiana University Medical Center in Indianapolis, and medical director of physician skincare, DermResearch, and skin sciences. Our guest this evening is Frank Watanabe, who is Chief Executive Officer of Arcutis Biotherapeutics. We'd like to thank our supporter, Arcutis Biotherapeutics, for making this educational event possible. Before we begin, a couple of logistic tips. If you're having issues hearing the webinar, you can listen to the presentation using your telephone. Just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you're having technical issues or if you would like to ask a question to our faculty, please submit your question using the question chat pane on the right-hand side of your screen. At the end of this webinar, a survey will pop up in your browser and will be emailed to you 1 to 2 days later. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could fill it in and send it back to us. Within 1 to 2 days of this webinar, a certificate of attendance will also be emailed to you. Again, if you have any questions, please submit your questions using the question chat pane on the right-hand side of your screen, and I wrote a note there so you know where to type in your question. So without further ado, I will pass the floor virtually to Dr. Leon Kircik.
Thank you, Roxanne, and good evening, everyone. We have a very exciting program tonight, but before that, couple of words about IDEF, International Dermatology Education Foundation. IDEF is a nonprofit organization whose principal mission is to raise awareness and improve dermatology care all over the world through education, especially in underserved areas. As you may remember, we have had quite a few programs over the last years, both in the US, Canada, as well as South America, Latin America, and Southeast Asia and Europe. Next. Our past programs include almost every dermatologic topic, including psoriasis, atopic dermatitis, acne, and some of our programs have been CME, some of them are promotional. And tonight, however, we have a very different program. We are very lucky to have the CEO of Arcutis, Frank Watanabe. And next slide, please. Where we're gonna discuss how to navigate the changing landscape of dermatology and industry relationship throughout the pandemic. And Frank, come on out, welcome.
Hi, Leon, how are you?
Very good to see you. We are very excited to have you because this is a different program and we wanna know all about Arcutis, which is a new company. We want to know about you. We want to know about your products. And I think I'm really looking forward to this. And I think a lot of the audience are looking forward to hear your perspective. And let's start first. First of all, welcome. I know it's a very, very busy time. But first, let's start with a little bit about Arcutis. Tell us a little bit about Arcutis. I know it's a new company. You just got started. So tell us about it.
Sure. So yeah, Arcutis, I guess it depends on what constitutes new. We're certainly newish. We're about a little over 6 years old now, and the company was founded specifically to address what we saw as the gap in innovation in medical dermatology. I think most dermatologists and dermatology clinicians understand that there's been a lack of innovation, particularly in the non-biologic space, right? I mean, there's been a lot of activity and progress in biologic treatments, but if you look at non-biologic treatments, until recently it had been over 25 years since there had been a new treatment for psoriasis. Just recently we had the first new treatment in acne in 40 years. Seborrheic dermatitis disease, you and I have talked about many times. I don't think any of us remember the last time a seb derm drug was approved. So, we saw this gap, and so Arcutis was created specifically to address that gap in innovation. And so we only do medical dermatology. We're a medical dermatology company through and through. I'm very proud of the fact that we actually have 7 medical dermatology clinicians on the faculty or on the staff at Arcutis, with 3 board certified derms, a derm NP and 3 derm PAs, and we have another board certified derm on our board of directors. So, I think you can get an appreciation for just how deeply embedded we are in dermatology. Many of the other folks at the company, including myself, have worked in dermatology for many years too. So, this is our sole focus. I think over the last 6 years, we've been fortunate to build a very robust pipeline of innovative drugs for various dermatologic conditions. We have our first drug approved and on the market now. And then we have, about 8 other different programs at various stages of development in the pipeline as well. And maybe we can talk about those a little bit later.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Now, I know you a little bit from your previous life, but why don't you tell us to everyone about a little bit about your previous life and about yourself?
So I've been in the industry for about a quarter of a century. Started out in big pharma. I was Eli Lilly for many years, and worked at Amgen for many years as well. Amgen actually was my introduction to dermatology. I worked on Enroll in dermatology way back when TNFs were the only options on the street, and then was at Kythera before the acquisition by Allergan. I had another start before Arcutis, and I've been at Arcutis now for 6 years. I was actually the 3rd employee at Arcutis after David Osborne, who you know well, who I think is probably the greatest topical formulator in our industry, and Howard Welgus, who many listeners may know, a wonderful clinical dermatologist from Washington University in St. Louis.
That's great. I noticed you have quite a few people from Amgen and Allergan on your team, so it's really nice to get those faces again in dermatology. And I know you from your dermatology times in Amgen, so it's really exciting again to have the similar team back. But you mentioned David Osborne, so how can we ignore that name? I think he is one of the biggest formulator, and I think you're so lucky to have him on board in topical dermatology. And we'll talk a little bit later about formulation. But so you just launched Zoria for plaque type psoriasis, and you brought it in the market. How does it feel to launch a new product during or just post-pandemic, and still the pandemic is sort of going on, unfortunately? How does it different than your previous launches, and how does it feel?
Yeah, boy, I'll tell you, it's ironic. I think we have about a dozen staff members with COVID today. This disease is not going away anytime soon. I have to say, we have not seen dramatic differences caused by COVID. I think that the dermatology community really stood out amongst medical specialties in how well and how quickly you all adapted to COVID. If you think back to, I think it was March of 2020, when the pandemic was just really taking hold. There were a number of offices that closed, but within 4 or 6 weeks, many dermatologists had figured out how to operate in COVID and reopened their clinical trial sites and their practices and managed through it. And I think that's a very marked contrast to other specialties like oncology, for example, where many of the patients are immunocompromised. It was much more difficult to operate during COVID. We actually ran a multitude of phase 3 studies, large phase 3 studies, many of which you participated in during COVID, and we didn't really see much of an impact to enrollment. We finished those studies all on time during COVID, and again, I think it's a reflection of the nimbleness of dermatologists in adapting to COVID. And we actually saw industry contacts, face-to-face interactions between doctors and sales representatives fairly quickly return back to baseline pre-pandemic levels in dermatology. And again, that's very different than in many other specialties. Some of the things that we do see that are different, and I think you've experienced some of these personally, I think what we're doing right now is one of the biggest changes. I think that the use of virtual meetings, whether that's for doctor rep interactions, virtual speaker programs, there wasn't much adoption of this technology prior to COVID. I think it's something that is here to stay. we've all realized the value of it. We all still enjoy getting together face to face. I remember the last year's Academy meeting in Boston. You know, it felt like the first week of college for all of us, right? Everyone was rushing around, catching up with old friends. But I think that, you know, this technology is going to continue to play an important role because it makes it so much easier for all of us to connect and to connect, you know, across the country and sometimes even internationally. So I think that's certainly a significant change. And I think one thing that we're continuing to monitor, I suspect many of your listeners are as well, is what role telemedicine is going to play in dermatology going forward. And I think personally, I think that's a big question mark. I think reimbursement is going to be one of the things that determines that. You know, I think given the uneven distribution of dermatology care in the United States, I think it potentially could have an important role to play in dermatology if we can get, you know, the reimbursement model sorted out.
So you touched upon quite a few important points that I was gonna ask or mention, but let's go a little bit in more detail one by one. We started with the clinical trials, right? And you're right, I was part of most of your clinical trial programs: seborrheic dermatitis, atopic dermatitis for adults, for pediatric population, even for infants, and then certainly the scalp psoriasis program. So the pandemic did not affect, you said that there was no enrollment problems and you were able to finish them on time?
Yeah, I think I would say there was a bit of a hiccup, you know, very early on in the pandemic, but very quickly our investigators got back to business, and we did not have any of our studies enroll behind schedule. You know, I think the one study that's probably been the hardest to enroll is the study we're doing in ages 2 to 5 in atopic dermatitis, but I don't really attribute that so much to the pandemic as it is, we all know it's just very difficult to enroll trials with very, very young children.
Correct. Unfortunately, you're right, and I'm part of that study too. We are always difficult to get, you know, most parents don't want their children to be poked and giving blood. You're absolutely right. I think that's independent of the pandemic. It's true for every study for infants. Then your other point was the virtual meetings, right? We were all 100% virtual during the pandemic, and then we went down to now a little bit live. You actually did a very nice live speaker program that I was part of it. It was very well done, very well organized. So do you think maybe we'll be a little bit virtual, a little bit live, or we'll go full live? How do you think it will impact?
Yeah, I would I'm going to answer this from a broader perspective, and then we can, maybe drill down to dermatology. But I think it's going to be very difficult to put this genie back in the bottle, right, with regard to virtual interactions. You think about the ease of having these meetings, and the savings in time, the lack of carbon footprint. There's a whole bunch of benefits to being able to do virtual interactions. At the same time, I think we have all learned going through the pandemic the value of in-person human contact, right? It's fine to conduct business over Zoom, but what you really miss is that relationship building, that personal bonding. We happen to be a hybrid company. We have people both located locally at our headquarters and people all around the country. And we've had to learn how to manage a hybrid environment like that, where we're partially online and partially in person. But those in-person interactions are really, really important. And so I don't think that we are going to go all the way back to live only like we were pre-pandemic. But I think we all also appreciate not being all online like we were during pandemic. And so there's going to be some mixture of the two, and it will probably vary depending on personal preferences as well as the nature of the business. And I think what we found is that interspersing in-person and virtual works the best, right? Because when we're together, we can go out to dinner together, we can catch up together, and then maybe the next couple of meetings we can do it by Zoom. And then after a couple months, we need to get back together again to re-solidify that friendship, and then we can go a couple months, right?
So how is it working in your headquarters? So I know your headquarters in LA. But yeah. I know on the other end, you live in Utah. I believe in Salt Lake City. or in Park City. Is it in Park City where
Park
you live?
City. Yep.
Right, that's beautiful. I take it you're a skier.
Avid skier. Yeah, in fact, I'm looking out my window at the mountains covered in snow right now as we speak.
That's beautiful. So how is it working? How often do you travel to the office?
Yeah, so personally, I'm in the office about every other week, usually not 5 days, but you know, probably spend 6 to 7 days a week, a month, excuse me, in the office. And that really varies depending on the individual and their job role, how often they're in the office. We do, as a company policy, bring everyone together once a month. We have an all staff, and that's partially, again, a mixture of work, you know, meetings where we meet face to face, but then also there's a big social component to those meetings, and that's where we're able to build that social capital that carries us from, you know, one monthly meeting to the next. And we found that that's really been vital to sustaining our organizational cohesion and our culture as we go through the pandemic. And you know, I think in some respects, you know, I think about professional societies as well. You know, you think about Maui Derm or Winter Clinical, and then you have the Academy meeting, and then you have summer AAD, and you know, we have these periods where we're all able to come together as a dermatology community, and then we go a long period without seeing each other, and then we come back together again, and we're able to manage through those periods of remoteness because we have those intense periods of togetherness during, you know, the major medical meetings.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. For a second I lost your voice. So I think I have never met such happy bunch of people in your group. So both from the medical side and from the marketing commercial side. And maybe tell us a little bit about your leadership style. But I know also we just talked a little bit earlier on that you had a military life in the past. I wonder if that has something to do, positive, negative, or how did that impact your leadership style?
Yeah, you know, Leon, that's actually a great question. It's a very topical question. You know, we have been, I think, blessed with a great team, and we've been recognized, you know, multiple times in the last year. You know, various Best Place to Work awards. I think we're number 3 on the biotech list this year, and that's very gratifying to me. I think that fundamentally, the pharmaceutical business is a people business, right? The people do all of the work. They invent the drugs, they develop the drugs, they make the drugs, they sell the drugs. So you have to attract and retain and motivate the best people possible. We spend a great deal of time and energy on the culture of Arcutis, and I think that's one of the ingredients that's helped us to attract really top-notch people. And I think the other thing that's really important is the mission. You know, people don't get excited about little ideas. You know, the author Simon Sinek loves to talk about, you know, start with why. And for us, the why is always helping the lives of people who are dealing with skin diseases. And if you always focus on, you know, the fact that you're working for a higher purpose, I think that helps people with motivation. I would say my leadership style is very much influenced by my time in the military. And I say it's very topical because I just came back from a conference last week of senior military, retired military officers and senior biotech executives talking about leadership in the two environments and how there's overlap between the two. I think there's a perception that the military is a very rigid and hierarchical organization.
Correct.
And that may be true in some countries, but in the US, it's actually not very true. One of the things that's made the US military so effective is a concept that the Army calls mission command, the Navy calls command by negation. The basic idea is you tell people what you want, and then you don't tell them how to do it, right? You know, you focus on the goal and not on the means, and then you give them the resources and the flexibility to figure out the means for you. And that allows you to tap into their creative energy. I don't know if you ever noticed, but I have a quote at the bottom of my email from General Patton who said, never tell people how to do things, tell them what you want and they'll surprise you with their ingenuity. And that really is the essence of my leadership style. And it's something that I learned from the military. And that's how the US military operates. It's one of the things that makes us so unpredictable as a military. And, you know, I think we're seeing right now today, unfortunately, this playing out in other parts of the world where you have two militaries, one that's very rigid and another one that's very flexible, and we all know who's winning that.
Yeah. You know, that's a great idea. I really love that saying. That's really very interesting, but it's so true. That is really so true. Speaking of that, how is your sales force? How many districts you have?
So, Lan, I lost you there for a second, but I think you asked about our sales force. So we have 9 districts in the U.S. We have 80 sales representatives calling on dermatologists. We only call on the dermatology specialty at this point in the game. You know, dermatology really drives the treatment of plaque psoriasis. You know, I think we'll have to see what we do in the future as we add additional indications and additional products. But for the moment, we're 100% dermatology focused. We also have a pretty good sized medical field team. We have 11 field medical liaisons out in the field calling on dermatologists as well and educating them.
How is the feedback from Zori for plaque type psoriasis? It's been recently launched. So are you getting any feedback? How is it?
Yeah, so you know, again, I know you have personal experience with the drug, and I would say, you know, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive about the product. And you know, just for the listeners to be aware, you know, Zuri was approved back in late July for the treatment of plaque psoriasis in patients at 12 years of age and above, and including, and I think importantly, including in intertriginous areas. So Zuri was actually the first topical ever approved specifically for the treatment of intertriginous plaques. So feedback has been very positive. I think doctors have found the drug to be very effective. You know, we frequently hear comment about the speed of onset. We've also heard not only reports of it working for intertriginous plaques, but really difficult to treat plaques like elbows and knees. And you know, that's consistent with what we showed in our clinical study. So that's been very encouraging. And the overall tolerability profile also has been very positive in clinical practice, consistent with what we saw, you know, in our clinical studies. And we had very, very low rates of adverse events. You probably recall, you know, the most common adverse event was diarrhea, mild to moderate diarrhea of 3%. And, you know, there was about 2% headache. So very low rates of adverse events. And that's been consistent with what doctors have been hearing out in the field. And then I think you wanted to talk about this a little bit later, but every clinician probably on the call, you know, recognizes that access is really critical. And I think we've had some very good early success in that regard. And we continue to hope to build on that. You know, I think it's important that it not be difficult for dermatology clinicians to obtain these new drugs. And so a lot of our efforts have been focused on trying to make it as easy for you and your colleagues to get access to Zuri.
You know, I think that's very, very important point, Frank, and I'm glad you brought it up. In our offices, every day we struggle with getting things approved for the patients, especially it's getting even more and more difficult now with novel topicals. So what have you done specifically on this area to work and to make it easier?
Yeah, so I think there's several things that I would say. You know, you've worked with us for a long time, so you know this has been a major area of focus for us as a company. You know, philosophically, I struggle with the idea of developing a really good drug that the patients who need it can't get, right? You're not helping them if they can't get it. And so we were very much focused on access early on. So, you know, we launched at a relatively low list price for our product. We're about 40% less than the last 5 branded topicals that have launched in terms of our list price. And that was really, again, designed to enable us to get good commercial coverage. We've been, I think, successful already in that regard. We announced just recently that that we had been put on the formulary for Express Scripts, the national preferred formulary at Express Scripts, with no prior authorization, which I think is really important, right? Doctors don't want to be writing PAs for topicals. And so that's been a big component of us making it available to commercial patients. We also have a copay assistance program where patients don't pay any more than $75 for a prescription, regardless of their insurance coverage of their commercial. And if they're reimbursed by the insurance company, it's only $25. And then, you know, there's a big chunk of patients that don't have commercial insurance. They're either Medicare patients or Medicaid patients, or they're just uninsured. And we recognize that that was a problem. You can't, you know, provide copay assistance by law for those patients. So Arcutis established what we call Arcutis Cares. It's a patient assistance program. And so financially qualified under and uninsured patients can receive Zuri for free from Arcutis. They do a very simple application, and then we ship the drug directly to those patients. And that's legal under the law for Medicare and Medicaid patients, as well as for the uninsured patients. And so, you know, it doesn't cover every patient, but certainly makes it a lot easier, especially for those patients who maybe don't have the financial resources to cover the cost of a drug themselves.
Actually, that's very commendable, and that's one of the biggest unmet needs, that we cannot get patient assistance or coupons or copay assistance to government insured patients. So that's a great news. I actually wasn't aware of that. That's really a great news that you have that.
You know, I would just emphasize it's very easy for the doctor and for the patient. You can just go to arcutiscares.com, and the patient fills out, it's a one-page front and back application, and then that's good for a year, and they can renew indefinitely for as long as they continue to qualify, and the doctor prescribes the drug, then they can receive the drug for free.
Great. So I am sure you have heard something called vehicles matter. So, you know, you brought up David Osborne, and I know him from his previous days, his Allergan days. I think he's one of the best topical formulators in our days in dermatology. So tell us a little bit about the special formulation that you guys have, that Zoria has. I think it's very unique, it's very special, it's very clever what you guys have done. Tell us a little bit to the audience. I think everybody is interested.
Yeah. So first of all, I have to brag a little bit on David. So David is our Chief Technical Officer. He's also our first employee. Joined the company even before I did. I would agree with you. I think he's probably the greatest formulator in the industry. I think he has 35 FDA-approved products. Zuri was his 35th that he had developed, and some very common, widely used topicals that clinicians would know that he did the development of. Just a brilliant gentleman, and also one of the nicest and most humble people that I know. So, you know, we knew a couple things. The first one was we knew it was important for the drug to be once a day, right? I mean, it's very difficult for patients to comply with any drug that's more than once a day, and especially for a topical, right? Because once you're dressed, you know, you don't want to be putting it on. It needed to, rub in easily. It needed to not smell, not to stain their clothing, and most importantly, it needed not to cause local irritation. And you know, David's known this from having developed so many drugs. So when he developed Zuri for topical roflumilast, you know, started out with developing a cream. Patients really don't like ointments, right? As you know. Yeah. And so it's a water-based cream. It's about 50% water. And he also made sure to not include any, you know, the common irritants that are usually used in topical drugs, right? So there's no propylene glycol, there's no polyethylene glycol, no isopropyl alcohol, no ethanol, no fragrances, so nothing that might upset your patient's skin. And you know, that's really critical, because if a patient's got to put a drug on every day for the rest of their lives, if it causes them problems, that's going to be an impediment to compliance with therapy, right? And so we have a formulation that rubs in very quickly. It doesn't smell, it doesn't leave a greasy residue or a tacky residue. It doesn't cause really hardly and negligible irritation. I mean, you know, in our clinical studies, I think in the phase 3 studies, you know, application site pain, which includes all or burning, itching, stinging, 1% in the phase 3 studies. So it's an exceptionally well-tolerated drug locally, and we think that's really important, certainly for compliance, and I think it'll be even more important in some of the other indications like, you know, atopic dermatitis, where you know how sensitive the patient's skin is to anything that would be irritating.
Well, now that you brought it up, I think after today's announcement, congratulations in order for the atopic dermatitis results. Tell us a little bit about that study and how did the results come about? Some of us heard the announcement. I think congratulations are in order, but tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so we actually just reported the results from our second phase 3 study in atopic dermatitis. We reported the results from the first study. I think it was right at the beginning of December, as I recall, about 3 weeks ago. Well, it may have been even late November. So we ran 2 parallel identical phase 3 trials in atopic dermatitis in patients 6 years of age and above. It is the exact same drug as what is approved in plaque psoriasis, except it's a different concentration, right? So Zuri for plaque psoriasis is 0.3%. Topical roflumilast for atopic dermatitis is 0.15%. We felt based on experience with steroids and what's been seen with some other drugs that we didn't need as high a concentration in atopic dermatitis. You don't have the thickened lichenified plaques. You have the skin barrier defects. So we felt that made sense to go with a lower concentration. Results look very good. Both studies highly statistically significant. We saw IgA success in the range of about 30% of patients. Importantly, over 40% of patients had an EASI 75 in both studies. We saw a significant impact on itch. And the results were all within 4 weeks, and we actually saw improvements on some endpoints at week 1 or week 2 as well. So it's working very quickly. And as we've seen in our other phase 3 studies, very safe and well tolerated, low incidence of adverse events. What we continue to see is a very low rate of the kind of typical PDE4 side effects that you would expect to see with a PDE4 inhibitor. Low rates of diarrhea, headache, maybe a tiny bit of nausea, things like that, but really nothing, even in the mid-single digits, frankly, in terms of incidence. We're very pleased with the overall results, and we're preparing now a supplemental new drug application to submit to the FDA. Probably submit that in the second half of next year, and we'll be looking forward to bringing topical roflumilast to the market and the dermatology community in the future.
So it's really impressive to have 30% range of IgA clear, almost clear, since you included mild patients, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And it's almost impossible to get 100% clearance with 2-grade improvement, right, in order to be success in those patients. So it's really pretty impressive that you were able to get that range of clearance.
Yeah, I think, look, you've again worked with this drug a long time. This is an unusual drug, right? It's not like other PDE4 inhibitors. I think the most important difference is that it is dramatically more potent than any of the other PDE4 inhibitors, including the FDA-approved PDE4 inhibitors. And I think that's allowed us to do things that just weren't possible with some of the other products, like topically treating plaque psoriasis, especially those really difficult to treat areas like elbows and knees. And we've seen good efficacy now in plaque psoriasis, in seborrheic dermatitis. You worked on that study, scalp psoriasis, and now atopic dermatitis.
I say that it's not your grandfather's Chevy, it's not your grandfather's PDE4 inhibitor, right? Unfortunately, we did have a topical PDE4 inhibitor that worked okay. So people always have that impression that especially for AD, topical PDE4 inhibitor may not be that effective. So still, some of us in the derm community may have that impression, unfortunately. So does that ever impact you think your drug?
So I think certainly that's a question that we get, and it's not an unexpected question, I think, or an unusual question. Clearly dermatologists are very familiar with PDE4, right? You've had 2 other PDE4s for quite some time, both the oral for psoriasis and the topical for atopic dermatitis. And so I think we get that question, and there may be some hesitancy on the part of some clinicians also to try Zuri. I would say that any doctor or any clinician who has concerns about especially local tolerability with Zuri should just try it themselves. Ask your rep for samples and try it yourself. And I think the drug will quickly prove its merits on its own, that you won't see the kind of burning and stinging that you may have seen with some of the other products. You certainly see much lower rates of adverse events than you see with some of the other products as well. I would just encourage the clinicians to try it themselves.
So let's go back to the formulation a little bit, because I know you guys have another formulation of Zuri that's coming hopefully to the market. We did the studies for scalp psoriasis as well as seborrheic dermatitis, still ongoing. So you want to tell us a little bit about that formulation?
Sure. Yeah. Again, having worked in dermatology for many years and having so many dermatology clinicians on staff, we knew what a struggle scalp psoriasis can be for doctors and patients to treat. And so when we started seeing the data with topical roflumilast early on, we said, hey, you know, we need to develop a foam. And so we sent David Osborne off to go and develop a foam for us. And developed, I think, a very nice, elegant foam, very similar to, you know, the hair mousses that we used to use back, you know, when we were younger. So it's very easy to apply, especially the hair-bearing areas of the body. And we have, and by the way, that foam is almost identical to Zuri in terms of formulation, right? It's water-based, exact same ingredients. The only difference is we use a little less oil, so you don't, you know, leave the hair greasy. And we've completed phase 3 studies in both seborrheic dermatitis and scalp psoriasis now. Both have shown very good efficacy. You know, on the body, the foam works very similarly to the cream in plaque psoriasis. On the scalp, it works even better. Seborrheic dermatitis, the results I think are remarkable. We had an 80% IgA success rate. 50% of patients were completely clear at 8 weeks. And as with the cream, we see a very favorable safety and tolerability profile. Tolerability profile for the foam is essentially identical to the cream. And so we're very excited about that program as well. We'll be filing the NDA for the foam in the early part of next year for seborrheic dermatitis. And so I would expect, you know, probably assuming the FDA approves it, you know, that product might be available, you know, late in 2023 or more likely early in 2024. But I think it's going to be an important addition. You know, there are very few foams out there that don't have a steroid in them, as you know. And even the ones that are available are often difficult to obtain, you know, because of access and reimbursement.
You know, correct me if I am wrong, I might be wrong, but there aren't that many topicals or anything approved for seborrheic dermatitis. I do remember ketoconazole foam, and I believe ketoconazole gel as approved for seborrheic dermatitis, but I cannot remember anything else. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe that you're correct. Those are the only 2 prescription products approved by the FDA for seborrheic dermatitis. Of course, you and your colleagues probably remember Promaceb, but believe that was approved as a device.
Correct.
But yeah, there's very little out there. Yeah, and you know, we know clinicians are typically using either ketoconazole or another azole and or topical steroids, but you know better than I do the challenges that topical steroids for seb derm can pose.
You know, I think Zoria might be the revolutionary treatment for seborrheic dermatitis for the face and scalp at the same time, especially when it comes on the foam formulation, which will be so easy for those patients to use one thing. You know, it's always once a day, one thing once a day, always gonna increase the compliance, make people's life easier.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think across the diseases, we hope to simplify management for the doctor and for the patient. I mean, we hear stories all the time of, you know, the doctors having to explain to the patient, use this drug on this part of your body and this drug on this part of your body and this part, and don't mix them up and call me in 2 weeks, you know, and to be able to just say, hey, put this anywhere, you know, no limitation on duration of use, and not having to worry about that confusion and saving the doctor time, I think is really important. And, you know, not only for seborrheic dermatitis, but you think about for scalp psoriasis, if you have a scalp psoriasis patient, once the foam is, or if the foam is approved in scalp psoriasis, you know, you could prescribe that one foam for the scalp and the body, because you're not giving anything in terms of efficacy on the body either.
Yeah, and we'll save money for our patients, right? One copay instead of 2-3 different copays, and
really good point.
3 different hassles to get prior authorization. So it's almost good for everyone involved.
Very good point.
Okay, so how about what else do you have in the pipeline other than roflumilast?
Yeah, sure. I'm excited to talk about that too. So the next program in our pipeline is we have a topical JAK inhibitor, and you know, we have a cream like other topical JAK inhibitors. We actually have the only topical JAK inhibitor that's JAK1 selective. I think we'll have to see what that plays out like in the clinic, but that is an important differentiator. And you know, we're developing that for chronic hand eczema as well as vitiligo. But I think the most exciting program is back to David Osborne. You know, oral JAK inhibitors have shown, as you know, very good efficacy in alopecia areata, whereas 3 different topical JAK inhibitors have failed in alopecia areata. You know, when we look at that fact pattern, we immediately think drug delivery. Right, there's a problem with drug delivery, right. And we all know that the inflammation in AA is quite deep in the skin, and it's difficult to deliver drugs topically deep into the skin. you hit the capillary plexus and it gets swept away into the blood. You've got the concentration gradient as you go deeper in the skin. So David and his team have developed a really unique, deep penetrating formulation of our JAK inhibitor that actually delivers the drug down the hair follicle, selectively down the hair follicle. And we just announced in the last couple of weeks that we've initiated a phase 1 study of that program. We call it ARQ-255, which is our deep penetrating JAK inhibitor. And we're hoping to be able to bring the very first topical treatment for AA to the market, if the data proves out and the FDA approves the drug. So that's very exciting. And I think the other thing that we're very excited about is earlier this year, we acquired a company from the UK called Ducentis. Ducentis had been working on a new, relatively new target in immunology called a checkpoint agonist. So this is sort of the opposite of the checkpoint inhibitors that they use in oncology, right? So if you inhibit checkpoints, you rev up the immune system. If you agonize checkpoints, you normalize activated immune cells, right? Which you might want to do in autoimmune diseases like atopic dermatitis. So this is an exciting new area in immunology. They have a very promising molecule that is an agonist for one of the immune checkpoints. And so we acquired that company and we're preparing now to bring that into the clinic as well. So this is a biologic, an injectable that we would be developing for moderate to severe atopic dermatitis, really complementary to topical roflumilast if it's approved for mild to moderate atopic dermatitis. And then we've got some earlier stage programs in acne, in nail psoriasis, palmoplantar psoriasis, and rosacea. So as you can see, we've got a very robust pipeline, and we hope to be able to bring many of these products to the dermatology community and help to reinvigorate the innovation in space.
So you are not a one-pony show.
No, we're definitely not a one-pony show, no.
So, but I think this is really exciting. But all the things that you talked about, the most exciting one is topical alopecia areata, right? Because that vehicle might be even used for tinea capitis, right? Because we always struggle to penetrate into the hair follicle. When you get that vehicle, the same platform, God knows, can be used for anything and everything else.
Yeah, I agree. If the technology proves out, we call it deep dermal drug delivery, or 4D technology. And this is a patented technology that David developed. If it works in alopecia areata, I think there are many other things that we could potentially treat, that diseases of the follicular unit. And so I think it'll be very exciting to think about what else we can do with 4D if we can prove it in the clinic.
Perfect. Before I go to the audience questions, Frank, do you want to say anything more?
Yeah, I would. I'd love to. I want to step back for just a minute and say something about innovation in the dermatology space. You've been around the specialty for many years. Probably many of your listeners have as well. One of the things that we observed is over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been massive consolidation in the dermatology space. In fact, we did a survey a couple of years ago. There were about 140 mergers and acquisitions in dermatology, and many of those companies, that you think about the Medicis of the world, or Stiefel, or Kinetics, some wonderful small dermatology-focused companies disappeared into larger companies that didn't continue to invest in R&D. And I think that's one of the things that drove this atrophying of the pipeline of innovative molecules. The other thing I think is that there are not very many companies that are really focused on purely the dermatology space. In the last number of years, we've seen a reemergence of several companies like Arcutis that are focused solely on dermatology, and I think that that's really important. I think the other thing that is important is for dermatology clinicians to realize that innovations will only continue if they use the new drugs, right? And we've seen a few of these new companies already disappear because their products weren't being used. Now, maybe that was for clinical reasons, right? But at the end of the day, if companies don't generate the money to reinvest back into R&D, let alone survive, there won't be further innovations down the road. And so I think dermatologists can help themselves by, looking at these new drugs and finding a place for them in their clinical practice.
I think that is such a great point, because we used to have great small dermatology companies, as you mentioned, such as Stifel, Medicis, Conetics, and they were focused on topical treatments rather than the biologics and the oral. I use a lot of biologics, I use a lot of systemic medications, but we still need the topical. I always say the foundation of dermatologic treatment, our shtick is topical treatment. And with the disappearance of these companies, such as the Stifels and the Medicis, unfortunately, we lost topical novel products. Innovation from the topical world is gone, unfortunately. And now you're right. We're grateful that such as Arcutis and other small companies focused on derm is sort of coming back. And unfortunately, sometimes the dermatology community is not aware of the fact that, if we don't give a chance, if we don't use those drugs that our patients need, and unfortunately, they will disappear too.
Unfortunately, that's true. Yeah, it really is. And clearly, these drugs aren't right for everybody, right? And you still have to navigate the access and reimbursement. But I think dermatology can help itself by adopting newer therapies, as they did with the biologics. And success will lead to follow-on success, and it will lead to follow-on innovation.
Yeah, but I think part of that is gonna be education of the existing, what I call the old timers, but also unfortunately, our residents, our people in training sometimes are not exposed to novel medications because they are in large hospitals or city-based or government-based hospitals where only they can use generics, right? And when they come out of the training, they are not exposed to the new medications and they don't know. So I think a lot of education is needed in those areas.
Yeah, there's no question. And I think, I think groups like IDF are important because dermatology is changing very rapidly now, right? I mean, you've had 3 new topicals approved by the FDA just in the last 12 months or so, right?
Yeah.
And every dermatologist needs to learn about these new drugs. You've got one new biologic in atopic dermatitis and another one that should be approved soon. You've got a couple of new biologics in the psoriasis space. There's a lot of things happening, and education, medical education by you and your peers at the various educational groups like FAAD and IDF, I think, are really critical to making sure that every dermatologist is aware of the science and aware of the data.
It's ironic, within the last year, within the last 10 years, we had 11 or more biologics for psoriasis. Absolutely nothing in the topical world except the last 2. Within the last 6 to 12 months, we had 2 topicals, right? Approved. Yep. So hopefully the trend will continue.
We're working on it.
Yes. Let me go and check some questions from the listeners. Let's see here. All right. Wow, this is a good one. Looking good, Frank. Did you order all those framed certificates and diplomas from Amazon? I'm not gonna tell you I'm not gonna tell you who's asking the question, but I love it.
I normally have a background here. Those are actually that's my I Love Me wall, as we call it in the military. Those are all various military decorations from my time in the service. And I didn't get it from Amazon, but that probably would have been a good idea.
All right. The other question is, well, it's an interesting one, and you may not want to answer it, but I'm going to ask anyway. Are there any acquisition plans either by others or by you for others?
So if anyone else is planning on buying Arcutis, I'm not aware of it. That's not usually how this works, right?
Right.
And I mean, look, honestly, we have never built this company to be acquired, right? It gets back to what you and I just talked about. We think that dermatology needs dermatology-focused companies with dermatologists and people who are dedicated to dermatology. And so it's our goal to remain an independent dermatology-focused company for as long as possible. You know, I don't control that. You know, if Takeda showed up tomorrow and offered $6 billion to buy the company, the shareholders may say yes. Right? But that certainly is not our intention. That's not the way we built this company. You know, that's why we have such an extensive pipeline, because we built this for the long haul. In terms of what we would acquire, you know, I would say that Ducentis is probably not the last acquisition that we will make. You know, we have a fairly high bar at Arcutis. You know, we really only look for molecules that are differentiated from other drugs, best in class. We don't do me toos, and we tend to focus on biological targets that have been validated in the clinic. And you know, the target that we acquired is a good example of that. And so that knocks out a lot of potential targets. But fortunately, there are a lot of interesting things happening in dermatology these days. And you know, I think we've built a really outstanding development organization at Arcutis. You know, clinical development as well as manufacturing. And so you know, we will continue to look for suitable innovations, and when we find them, you know, we very well may acquire them, particularly if we feel like we can add something, right? So in the case of Ducentis, this was an early, very high science preclinical company that didn't have the ability to take the drug into the clinic. And so when we approached them to say, you know, we'd like to acquire you and your product, they were actually quite happy, because they weren't quite sure how they were going to take the next step. Right. They were going to have to build this huge organization. We said, well, we already have that, so why don't we just do this together? And you know, and that's you know, I hate the cliche, but it was a good win-win kind of scenario. And I think it's something that will allow us to create a great deal of shareholder value for both our old shareholders as well as the old Ducentis shareholders who are now Arcutis shareholders as well.
I have a question that you brought up, the manufacturing. Where is your manufacturing being done?
So we use a large site in Texas for our drug product. It's, I think, the largest topical manufacturing site in North America, maybe one of the largest in the world. A very well-established company. They're very good at what they do. We don't own our own plant. You know, it's not really any need to do that at this point in the game. And so it's all manufactured in the United States. We buy the active ingredient from Europe.
Nice. We have a question about your role. It says, what's Arcutis's role in medical education, in dermatology programs, etc.?
Yeah, another great question. So, you know, I think there are two prongs, I would say, to our medical education efforts. Arcutis itself does a lot of medical education. You know, as I mentioned, we have a field medical team that's sole purpose is to educate clinicians about our products. We also have a medical affairs team that focuses on things like publications. We recently had a publication in JAMA of our plaque psoriasis phase 3 studies. And then separately, we provide support to groups like IDEF through the medical grant process, right? Independent support to IDEF, to FRED, to the Maui Derm group. We provide support to the American Academy of Dermatology, right? So, and you know, those are all arm's length. They have to be arm's length because of the nature of the work that you all are doing. But you know, that's one of the things that we're committed to doing is constantly investing in the education of the dermatology clinician community.
By the way, thank you so much for your support for IDEF. I appreciate that. And moving on to another question, when do you expect the results of the alopecia areata study to be available?
So yeah, so this is you know, a new formulation, and it's a drug that's been in the clinic before, but we had to do a phase 1 study. And so we're running phase 1 study now. I don't think that will give us much data on efficacy. Hopefully it'll give us some sense of whether we're getting you know, the penetration that we're looking for, but it'll really be the follow-on phase 2 study, I think, where we'll start to see some efficacy. So it's going to be a little while before we see any data coming out of efficacy data coming out of the ARQ 255 program.
Another question, is the vehicle for the atopic dermatitis cream different from Zoria?
No, it's entirely identical. The only difference between Zoria and the drug that's in the clinic for atopic dermatitis is the concentration of roflumilast.
Perfect. Well, we are almost at the top of the hour. I really want to thank you for this very, very insightful conversation. and I look forward to seeing you, I'm sure, in one of the next meetings. So thank you very much again for your support, for Arcutis' support. And I'd like to wish good night and happy holidays to everyone.
Thanks, Lynn. Look forward to seeing you in Hawaii, and happy holidays.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.